Hello everyone and welcome to this third Green Cities webinar. Today's webinar is about making places greener, practical tools and insights. I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar. I know we have people from, I think from all over the world, which is really exciting. So thank you for finding time to join us today. My name's Julia Thrift and I will be chairing today's webinar. I'm the Director of Healthier Placemaking at the TCPA, the Town and Country Planning Association. Before we go any further, I'll introduce the Green Cities project. Green Cities is a pan-European campaign to promote the importance of making our urban areas greener by planting more trees and shrubs, improving parks and green spaces, and enhancing what is known as green infrastructure, so the networks of green spaces, green roofs, parks and gardens that provide so many benefits to us all. Green Cities is being run in 7 European countries and it's funded by the European Commission's Consumer, Health, Agriculture and Food Executive, and we're very grateful to them for funding this project and making it possible. I'm now going to switch my camera off so that you can see the screen and just explain to you how to work the control panel that you will have on your screen. So you've got a GoToWebinar control panel. There's a section called questions with a little arrow next to it. If you click on that, a box will open and you can type your questions in that box. So feel free to ask questions at any point throughout the webinar, and we will save up your questions for the questions and discussion session at the end of the webinar, and we'll put questions to speakers then. But you can ask your questions at any point during the webinar. So we'll also be tweeting, and we'd very much like you to join in the Twitter discussion using the hashtag GreenCitiesUK. So do join in. We've got a really excellent panel of speakers today, people with a lot of practical knowledge and insight into how to make things happen. So in previous Green Cities webinars, we've had discussions about policy, but today is very much about practice, putting this into practice, and tools and methodologies and insights to help you do just that. So I'm very pleased that today we've got Penny Griffith from Swansea Council and Fran Rolfe from Natural Resources Wales, Peter Massini from the Greater London Authority, and David Lowe from Warwickshire County Council. But before we hear the speakers, we'd love to find out more about you, the audience. We've got almost 400 people in the audience today, and people are joining every second. I can see the numbers going up just as I speak, which is very exciting. We'd love to know where you're all listening from and joining this webinar. So there's going to be a quick poll for you to fill in. You should be able to see it on your screen, and you can let us know where you are watching from. I know that in the first webinar, we had people from as far afield as Australia, which is really exciting. So do fill in the poll and let us know where you're from. Also, just to let you know while you're filling in the poll, we do have some handouts for you that you can download. Again, they're available via the GoToWebinar control panel. So if you look on the control panel, there's something that says handouts with a little arrow next to it. Click on it and you'll find the links to be able to download them. So I hope that everyone has had a chance to fill in the webinar, the poll, and let us know where they're from. And well, here we go. So England 79%, Wales 8%, Scotland 3%, Northern Ireland 1%, and the wonderfully mysterious elsewhere 9%. So a really good turnout from England this time, and really interesting to see where you're from. So wherever you are, you're welcome, and I hope you enjoy today's webinar. So now let's go over to our first speakers who are going to do a double act for us about creating a greener Swansea. So I'd now like to hand over and welcome Penny Griffiths and Fran Rolfe. Penny is Sustainable Policy Officer at the City and County of Swansea Council and has worked in sustainable development both nationally and locally for more than 15 years. She's particularly interested in the way that behavioural and cultural change plays in enabling large public sector organisations plan for the future. I'm also going to introduce Fran, who I don't know whether Fran's going to be speaking immediately or a little bit later. Fran Rolfe is Sustainable Places Officer at Natural Resources Wales. She's developed partnership projects across the public, private and third sectors to involve communities in the sustainable management of natural resources. And between them, I think they're going to give us a really interesting insight into the really creative way that Swansea has gone around thinking about and implementing green infrastructure. So thank you both very much, and over to you. Penny, I think you need to put your microphone on.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello? Right, my microphone says it's on.
Yeah,
can anybody...
we can hear you now.
We can now hear you, thank you.
Yeah.
Brilliant. I'm very sorry. I don't know what happened there. So I was saying Prynawn da, or good afternoon, which is Prynawn da is Welsh for good afternoon. And I'm really pleased to join you this afternoon. Fran and I are going to do this presentation as a double act. I'm Penny Griffith and I work for Swansea Council. We always do this presentation as a double act, or any presentation or any time we work together in any engagement work, because it really sort of demonstrates the ethos of what we've done with this project and the development of this strategy, as we have done everything together on a 50-50 basis between the two organisations. So I'm going to talk about building a better Swansea and a greener Swansea city. If I could have the next slide, please. So to start off with, well, why make a strategy? This quote here from Professor Yolanda Barnes at the Bartlett Institute at UCL, I think is now even more pertinent than it was 10 weeks ago. Today, you know, sitting where we are now, following what we've all experienced in the last 10 weeks, I think the importance of where our placemaking is in nature has become more and more important, as I'm sure you all agree. So this statement seems very, very relevant, but I would also like to introduce a Welsh word. The word I'm going to introduce is a beautiful word. It's cynefin. Now, cynefin has no direct English equivalent, but it translates as place. But for the Welsh people, Welsh speakers, it's much, much more than place. It's about a sense of place. It's about your environment. It's about your community, your physical habitat, your spiritual habitat. And for me, this is what Professor Barnes's quote is about. It's talking about not just my home as my house, but as my place, as where my heart is, as my square mile. And for me, green infrastructure, or for sort of Fran and I, green infrastructure is very integral to what this means. It is about our sense of place. It's about clean water, clean air, our food, biodiversity. So, but why do we decide to go down the route of a strategy? Well, as Fran would tell you, she's not a big fan of strategies. They can tend to be expensive and resource hungry, and sometimes it is quite questionable about what they really do. But for someone who works in local government, strategy is really, really important, because it gives us a strategic approach. It gives us something to hang, to hook our aspirations on. It enhances the conversation and it can lead to collective actions. So whilst strategies can do nothing, they can also do quite a lot. So after a long discussion about what we wanted our strategy to be, we decided a strategy was a good way forward. Next slide, please. We are also very, very lucky in Wales that we have a lot of national policy and legislation that really supports green infrastructure and where we are trying to go with improving our placemaking. We have the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is a piece of legislation that was adopted in Wales in 2015. And this basically places well-being, macro well-being, which is not just about our personal well-being, but our collective national well-being, at the centre of everything public organisations have to do. We all have a duty. That's my organisation as a local authority and Fran's organisation, Natural Resources Wales. We have a duty to do everything we can to improve Wales's prosperity, which includes low carbon societies, to improve its environmental resilience, its health, and that includes mental and physical health, making Wales more equal, making it cohesive, and making sure we are being responsible in our global actions, and also making sure we are making the most of our culture and our thriving Welsh language. The Welsh Environment Act is also another very, very important piece of legislation, which received assent in 2016. This piece of legislation requires that a lot of public organisations, not all public organisations, but a number of public organisations have a duty to enhance and protect biodiversity and to build resilient ecosystems. We also have, as an organisation, the council, we have our own corporate priorities, NRW also has a collective and their own corporate priorities about improving and enhancing biodiversity. And our most recent piece of legislation is our statutory standards around SUDS, which is not only about SUDS improving water quality or sustainable urban drainage improving water quality, but also improving biodiversity and amenity access to green space. Next slide, please. So I hope that's given you some context of the great legislation that we have in Wales to sort of underpin what we're trying to do. So we decided that the strategy was the way we wanted to go. We wanted to go forward with a strategy. And so working jointly on a 50-50 funding and managed project between the council and NRW, we brought on board Green Infrastructure Consultancy. We recognised as two public organisations that when it came to urban green infrastructure, we really wanted to focus foremostly on Swansea City, because we're having some really large regeneration programs of works going on in the city centre at the moment. So we wanted to focus there firstly, and we were aware that we didn't necessarily have all the skills we needed around urban green infrastructure. Green Infrastructure Consultancy, however, did have some fantastic skills as a world-renowned and leading organisation on urban green infrastructure. So we brought them on board with us to work with us to develop a strategy. We knew we wanted our strategy to enhance and ensure the quality of green infrastructure in the city centre. We wanted it to look at new technologies and techniques. We wanted it to influence strategic investment in GI. We wanted it to enable a simple but reliable form of assessment to help us to assess GI in the city centre and assess that quality and enhancement. We were also really keen to move away from green landscaping and to really focus on the multifunctionality of green engineering. So designing our green infrastructure for its functionality, not just about how it looked. So the good question we always ask people, and we always ask ourselves, is when we are looking at urban greening, we need to be asking, what is its function? Next slide, please. Fran and I, our modus operandi as we developed this project was really also based around the Wellbeing Future Generations ways of working. These are 5 behaviours that the Act requires us to look at, and they are prevention, so that's about understanding barriers to implementation, taking an integrated approach in everything we do, which is understanding everybody involved and what their goals are. Collaborating, which is about authentically and working with each other, taking a multidisciplinary approach, always planning for the long term and making sure that we keep a balance between short-term pressures and long-term gains, and very importantly, involvement. I will now hand over to Fran, who's going to go into much more detail, particularly around the collaboration and particularly the engagement and the involvement and engagement element of this, because this is where I think we really did something a little bit different for Wales and Swansea.
Okay, next slide, please. Hi, everybody. I'm Fran. So here's a really famous quote: "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." And as Penny alluded to at the beginning, I'm not known as a fan of strategies. They're often expensive coasters and they sit on a shelf, not doing a great deal. So how do you make strategy do more? I'm really thinking about the culture of the organizations. This is all about people. This is about how we behave. This is about how our public sector behaves, how it interfaces with the community, how it interfaces and interacts with businesses. And so we recognized that this was about people, relationships, and we needed to learn to trust each other, spend time with each other, and have the willingness to really try and see things from each other's each other's side, and have an understanding. And procurement was one of the really big challenges for us, because actually procurement is so rigid and strict, that we built the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act principles into, as Penny mentioned those earlier, we built those into the procurement process. It was a challenge. We had two big organizations with two complicated processes. So we sharing services and learning to work differently. And the only way a strategy is going to be successful is if people want to use it. And that was kind of the thing that we really wanted to achieve. So if I could have the next slide, please. Okay, so here's a lovely image of lots of different people who we talked to in the engagement. Now, we did lots of different types of engagement. So we did, as shown in this picture, street-based community engagement, which involves face-to-face conversations. We talked to over 630 people in 3 weeks of February in 2019. And we didn't talk to them about green infrastructure, because that is not a term that everybody knows about. So we talked to people about nature in their city. And we also had professional workshops with the public sector, staff, developers, businesses. We had some individual meetings with politicians. You know, we engaged the politicians in the cabinet particularly. That was really important to get them on board. And we had a really clear message from the electorate to get green infrastructure into our city. And what we found when we did these professional workshops, we came up with these barriers. You know, what is it? So we've had 30 years of all this amazing information that tells us looking at a tree reduces your blood pressure. You know, this is all really good stuff and we need it. And yet we're not seeing it happen. It's not the modus operandi. So what was stopping us and what do we need to overcome those? So from our work with people, we found out that governance, so staff feeling that they're not empowered or allowed to do it. Knowledge, skills and training, you can't ask or assess what you just don't know. And actually, that's quite a vulnerable place to be, particularly in the public sector when budgets are tight. And maintenance, so lack of understanding of maintenance regime, it's often used as a way to close the conversation around green infrastructure. So how do we change that? What do we need to do that? The engagement process told us our citizens and visitors wanted a greener city with less hard surfaces, you know, and instead of, you know, create spaces for wildlife, for people. They wanted an improved visitor and trading experience. You know, at the end of the day, cities are part of the economic hub of the region, and we wanted to create a destination. You know, they told us that they wanted to create a destination city. This isn't just the community. This is the collection of everybody we spoke to, and they wanted the city to adapt to climate change. You know, this is a huge thing on pretty much everyone's minds at the moment. So we involved our community, we involved businesses, huge engagement across the public sector. That was really, really crucial to changing the conversation around this. And changing the conversation probably doesn't sound that powerful, but actually being in meetings now with different departments, different organizations, different public sector bodies, and them talking, everybody is talking about green infrastructure in Swansea. Everyone is asking about, well, how can we put this? Can we do this? Can we do that? And that step changing conversation is massive. We've had huge social housing engagement, you know, brought into regeneration projects, schools. Really crucially, we wanted to talk to young people in the schools that serve the city catchment about how they felt about nature in the city. And when we asked the question, what is nature in the city to you? That is it. It's a really simple, open question, and it allowed people to tell us their story about what they like or what they don't like or how they feel about something. So next slide, please. So here we have the 5 themes that came out of the engagement work. And the big heart is well-being. So this was people describing their emotional response to nature. So happy, good, nice, smile, quality, health, pretty, love, peaceful, and joy. Never underestimate the word joy. And then the physical physical one, the trees, the parks, the green, flowers, the birds, the butterflies. That's the butterfly one, sorry, I didn't say that. Castle Square, which is the square down at the bottom in the middle. Castle Square is a place in Swansea that once had a traditional kind of Victorian rose garden, and now it's all kind of flagstones and granite, the kind of common response that we've seen, probably in the last 30 years to antisocial behaviour and things like that. Well, let's just make it, not particularly pleasant for most people to be there, and then we won't have the antisocial behaviour, but we don't really have anyone there. And people told us in the engagement that they used to meet other people who worked in the city on their lunch breaks and stuff like that. So actually as a space, it was really crucial and important. And now it's kind of a, bit of a barren place, and the council certainly has an interest in greening that area. And we also had the negative things that people said about it. So we called this loss, because actually people talked about it as if it was they'd lost something. Someone even said we've had just this constant net loss of greenery in the city, whether it's loss of trees or there's just not enough green. We get told something and then we get more concrete, more hard surfaces. That's all they see, and they felt loss around that. And then the bottom speech bubble is opportunities and nature, green city. And we did not make it say that. Those were the words that had the most use. But people were telling us here that they wanted more flowers, that they wanted more trees. People said green walls, green roofs, more water, space for children to play in water, space for wildlife for water. It was multifunctional spaces for families to go and enjoy and enhance that sort of visitor experience, and residential experience. Next slide, please. So we had a series of guiding principles with Green Infrastructure Consultancy, and those on the screen enabled us to develop 5 principles which are in our strategy, and they are multifunctional, biodiverse, adaptive to climate change, healthy, smart and sustainable. The multifunctionality, as Penny alluded to earlier, looking at every piece of greenery. Anyone ever shows you a map and says, oh, well, we're going to put this tree here, what does it do? And it needs to be doing more than 3 things. It needs to be doing 3 or more things. It can't be, it just looks nice, or it's just good for biodiversity. We really need to be stacking the multifunctionality into what we're putting into our urban environments. Next slide, please. So the vision of our strategy is high quality, multifunctional green infrastructure, delivers resilience, prosperity, nature, health, well-being, and happiness to the citizens and visitors of Swansea. Health and happiness. No one's really going to disagree with that. We think, during some of our engagement work we've done since then, where we might tweak a few words here and there, but really the essence of, we should all have, humans deserve good habitats too. We don't really think about that. So we should have a resilient, prosperous place. Prosperity really came through from all the departments and all the organizations working, and the traders and businesses who, their triple bottom line matters. And actually, if we can make the market argument, as Yolanda clearly states in the quote at the beginning, that's what matters. And next slide, please. So we have these overarching strategic objectives, providing a high quality environment, creating a distinctive destination city, and a lot of this links it in with other strategies that are already exist for regeneration in the city, particularly adapting to climate change. Sponge City really tells you what you want it to do in terms of holding on to water. So we wanted to use language here that actually made sense to people. We recognize that some of it is a bit technical. Urban island effect. Swansea is it's got a lot of hard surfaces at the moment, and there is massive scope to change that. And it was really crucial to us to involve, engage and educate communities, because again, going back to that point of, you can't, politicians respond to public pressure. So if we've got 630 people saying, well, actually this is what matters to us, not that, or we really want this, that's really, really important. It was not just Penny and I saying, well, we know the community want this is a really good thing, we should have this. The voice was given to the people so that they could tell them and continue that conversation and really lead by example. Let's be good at it, let's do this. Then we talked about attaining wildlife well-being friendly sort of statuses like biophilic city, national park city, and we've been moving forward with some of those, particularly national park city, because that's a really community-led, it's not owned by the public sector, and I think that's quite important for the success of some of these. Next slide, please. So we're going to achieve this. So here are some of the targets. So in terms of up in green infrastructure, threshold green infrastructure from 26% to 26% by 2030. Improving canopy cover. Swansea, like a lot of cities, has seen a loss of significant canopy cover in the city. So that's something that really came through in a lot of the engagement, and it was really important to people. And meeting, so we talk about green roofs on new developments. Well, once we've got green roofs, how do we ensure the quality of green roofs? And to do that, really, we want it to be all green roofs meet the GROW code standard. There is a UK code of practice for green roofs, and if we say that actually this is the minimum standard that we're going to meet with green roofs, then we're going to see multifunctionality coming into our green roofs rather than just blanket cedar matting, which is green by name only. So expecting developers and planners to use the tools such as the Green Space Factor tool. Penny will mention that in a minute, and I know Peter's going to go into that in detail, so we won't. And becoming a Trees in the Townscape champion. Again, trees came up so heavily in Swansea that we really had to have a couple of special tree targets. And then over to Penny.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah, it's green. Right, okay, so just what I'd like to also add to that is, along with our vision, we sort of have like a strap line to our vision, which was given to us by a member of the public when we were doing our face-to-face consultation, which was a city that is bare is a city that doesn't care. A city that is green is a city where I want to be seen. And I think that sort of sums up a lot of the feeling that we got from members of the public when we talked to them. I said earlier on that we wanted a tool. I won't go into detail on the Green Space Factor tool, but what we've got is a Green Space Factor tool that measures the quality and functionality of green infrastructure across the city centre, and that it does that through the planning process. So we were looking at assessments that we could use that would be easy for people to use, applicable, and also could be used on a number of different type of sites. Which so we're using the Urban Greening Factor. I won't go into detail because I believe Peter's going to afterwards. So if I can have the next slide then, please. So really, this is sort of our penultimate slide. Just wanted to sort of tell you a little bit about what we've learned over the last two to 3 years. So our seeds have definitely germinated. We haven't actually adopted the strategy yet. It went out to consultation at the end of last year. We were looking to adopt it in the spring. Unfortunately, that's been slightly delayed, obviously because of lockdown, etc. But we're looking to adopt that now in the coming months. But despite that, and I think this is the real benefit of the fact that we had a transparent, highly engaged process that helped us develop the strategy, is it's already being used. The council, we're already piloting the Green Space Factor tool. Developers, private developers, are asking to use the Green Space Factor tool. As Fran said, we're working with social registered landlords, also looking to use the document and referring to the document in grant applications. We've actually also influence local and national funding as well. So we work very closely with Welsh Government, and some funding was made available this year for green infrastructure that sort of really worked using the principles and what we've discovered over the last sort of 18 months. So it's been a real sort of like a totally group collaboration, if you like, between a lot of different people from across the sectors. So what have Fran and I really taken away from this process? Well, it's definitely conversations. The value of conversations cannot be underestimated. It's such a strong tool to have, both if you're talking politically, if you're talking with colleagues. Conversations and understanding where other people are coming from is vital. Asking good questions. You can eke out so much information from that about what others are thinking and what's important to them. Learning to use each other's language, spending time together, and being genuine and meaningful about the way that you engage and about the way that you work with each other. We had a really flat structure in our steering group. We all came from, we were multidisciplinary. We had planners, members from NRW, people from nature conservation, people from building control, from park services, and we all sat and discussed and respected each other's expertise and each other's capabilities, and that was really important. And then possibly one of the biggest has been with the type of experts you work with. Not only did Green Infrastructure Consultancy have a fantastic previous proven track record, but they also really shared our ethos and what we wanted to do, and that has been absolutely invaluable. I mean, I think both Fran and I see it as the best 2-year apprenticeship we've ever been on. We have learned so much, and we've really closed that local skill gap that we had. Okay, last slide, please. I see we've run over a little bit. Right, so really just to say, come live, work and play in our nature city. Our next steps is we need to get the city centre strategy adopted, and now we've started engaging on a county-wide strategy, which seems a bit backwards in coming forwards, but we wanted to maximise the opportunity we had in the city centre, and now we want to look at the whole of Swansea as a county and see how we can enhance and improve our green infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Penny and Fran, thank you so much for that presentation. Really, really fascinating. And I love the mixture of strategic thinking, but really learning from the community and asking such great questions. So thank you both. Just to remind you, while you're listening, that you can ask questions using the GoToWebinar control panel. Click on the question button and there's a space underneath. Do ask your questions. We're not going to put questions to the speakers after each presentation, but we will take questions at the end. And we're also tweeting using the hashtag Green Cities UK, so do join in the conversation on Twitter as well. So it now gives me great pleasure to welcome our next speaker, Peter Massini from the Greater London Council. Peter is the Green Infrastructure Lead at the Greater London Authority, sorry, not Council, where he's been working to embed a policy framework in the London Plan that aims to make London a greener and more livable city. So Peter, thank you very much for joining us. Do make sure your microphone's on, and over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks everyone for listening in today. It's a little bit dark in the room I'm here, so I'm slightly sort of in the shade here, but hopefully you can hear me properly. So I'm going to talk a bit about why we've introduced an urban greening factor in London to help us deliver that agenda, that vision of a greener city. Next slide, please. So London, like many other cities, is an expanding city, a big city, and the direction of travel in terms of new development is for the city to become a bigger, denser city. You know, most big world cities are becoming increasingly dense, that density being part of the sustainability agenda to focus issues around public transport, preventing urban sprawl. So one of the big questions, one of the big challenges we have is how we make a denser city, a greener city, which seems a slight conundrum and a huge challenge. But the urban greening factor that we're introducing, we think is going to be a way in which we can make that greener, denser city in the future. Next slide, please. So London for years has had a very good land use planning framework, which has protected much of the core resource of green spaces, parks, nature reserves. And that's why London's actually already a green city, because of that fantastic extensive network of green spaces. But as we densify, as we increase the amount of housing and associated facilities like schools and hospitals in cities, that density, that increased development starts to encroach onto the boundaries of those green spaces. And we know this type of solution isn't ideal, where you have high density development right on the edge of a protected green space. So we need to find different, more subtle solutions to how we accommodate new development, dense development in the city. Next slide, please. And the COVID crisis has illustrated the issue about lack of existing parks and green spaces in cities. The sharp-eyed amongst you will notice this is not a picture of London, it's a picture of New York. But we've had the same issue in London over the last few weeks because of the lockdown, because of people wanting to use outside space. We know we can't create lots of new parks, so we need to find different ways of providing greener spaces in the city that provide some of the benefits of parks. Clearly, those that greener public realm won't provide the same facilities and the same experience as a park, but we can create a greener public realm that provides some of the benefits that's currently provided by a traditional parks network. Next slide, please. So in London, we have a strategic planning framework, the London Plan, which sets out a whole range of spatial development policies. Those policies include the traditional policies about protecting existing public space, but we're introducing policies now which are about accelerating urban greening of the public realm, how we actually transform buildings, the built environment, and some of our street network into greener public realm, greener spaces. Next slide, please. So the urban greening policies we've introduced in the London Plan, they're actually an iteration of a policy framework we've had in place for a number of years. 10 years ago, we introduced a planning policy framework for green roofs, which encouraged developers to incorporate green roofs into their new developments. That was very successful. But now we need to move on to a slightly more prescriptive approach where we ensure that all new developments incorporate a much wider range of urban greening. Next slide, please. So we've introduced this policy of urban greening in the London Plan, and that actually requires all developments to include urban greening as a fundamental element of site and building design. So it's asking developers and working with planning authorities to think about what is the optimal type of greening that all developments could introduce. So that will still include things like green roofs, but increasingly things like green walls, sustainable drainage, and thinking about how what may have previously been landscaping can be designed to provide a range of benefits other than the aesthetic adornment of your development. Next slide, please. And we're asking the London boroughs, who have responsibility for most development planning and planning permissions in London, to set target scores for developments. Residential developments will need to meet a target score of 0.4, and I'll explain what that means in a moment, and commercial development at the target score of 0.3. And these scores allow planners working with developers to optimize the greening of new developments. I'll explain a bit about how that's actually achieved. So next slide, please. So the urban greening factor promotes better quality greening. It includes a factor, which is a factor given to different types of urban greening, and the better the quality of the urban greening, or the better functioning urban greening, has a higher factor. So if you look at this table, clearly things like existing semi-natural vegetation has a factor of 1. It's the best thing to do, and if you can retain it on site, that significantly contributes to your urban greening score. But as you go down the table, you can see other types of urban greening which achieve a high score. So intensive green roofs, trees planted in natural soils or connected with tree pits, they score much higher than other forms of amenity greening. And if you look at the two scores or two typologies I've highlighted here, you can see that tree pits that are connected or trees that are planted in natural soils have a factor of 0.8, whereas the sort of typical standard tree planted in a roadway with minimal soil volume has a lower factor. So what this does is encourages planners, developers to think about the better quality of greening that they can incorporate into their development. So effectively point to win prizes. The better quality greening you do, the more likely you are to meet the urban greening factor score. Next slide, please. And the score is calculated in a very simple way. It's effectively the urban greening factor, the factor, times by the area of the typology. So if you're putting in a green roof, intensive green roof, you'll score 0.9 times by the area of that green roof. You add together the different factors times by the area and divide it by the total site area, and that arrives at a score for the site. And usually it's well below 1, because clearly it's rare that you'll get complete coverage of urban greening. Although if you do green walls on all your development, you can actually score above 1. But we're looking for a score of say between 0.3 and 0.4. It sounds a bit low. People think, well, that doesn't sound very high. But actually, when you look at an urban development and you think about the other requirements of an urban development, including things like footways, pavements, some of those surfaces which will always need to be hard, achieving an urban greening factor of 0.3 or 0.4 is challenging. It's achievable, but it does actually push developers to do more than they might otherwise do with a much more generic policy for urban greening. Next slide, please. So when does the urban greening factor apply? So it applies to all major developments. That's any development above 10 units. So it covers the majority of developments in London. It applies across the whole of the city. It's not just on certain areas. The whole of the city has to apply the urban greening factor. But importantly, it needs to be applied in combination with other policies. So the urban greening factor isn't a license to damage or destroy existing open space, existing natural habitats, or existing trees and replace them with urban greening. Other plan policies ensure the protection of those existing assets. So it's something you do after you've addressed other planning policies around green infrastructure. Importantly, and something that was some important point we had to make at the examination in public, the review of the London plan, that by applying the urban greening factor, you can actually meet other policy objectives. So if you design your urban greening well, you can also meet objectives around biodiversity net gain, sustainable drainage, and meeting some of the air quality targets in the London plan. And that was quite an important point to make when we were trying to get the London plan policy through the planning inquiry, because it was recognised that the urban greening factor wasn't an additional requirement, it was a complementary policy to a range of other policies. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of how the urban greening factor has been applied in practice. Developers are now looking to apply the urban greening factor as local authorities begin to put them in the local plans. And this was a planning application that was submitted to Tower Hamlets local authority, and also to the mayor, because some planning applications are submitted to the mayor for consideration. And when it first arrived, it looked like a reasonably good planning application on first glance. Lots of greening. This was for a hotel or a motel in East London, and it included landscaping and greening of the areas which were set aside for car parking. But once we applied the urban greening factor, it scored quite low, and the reason it scored quite low is because a lot of the green on there is actually grasscrete. It's car parking spaces which have a limited amount of greening in the spaces between the concrete. That's something that should be welcomed, but doesn't really push the boundaries of urban greening. So we asked the developers to go back and think again. And next slide, please. They came back with a much reviewed and amended and updated planning proposal, which first of all substantially reduces the amount of car parking space, and the London plan is really pushing back on the provision of car parking spaces in most new developments. And by rethinking the layout of the car parking, reducing the number of spaces, but also thinking much harder about the landscaping, or what was previously landscaping at development, they've now come up with a scheme that has a much higher quality and a much greater functionality in terms of sustainable drainage, biodiversity benefits, and addressing issues of climate change. And if you go to the next slide, They did a calculation of the urban greening factor, looking at each element of their overall landscape plan and measuring it against the urban greening factor table in the London plan, and they come up with a score of 0.35, which is a pretty good score for a development in a very urban part of East London. So an important point to make is that when we ask developers to meet the target score of 0.3 or 0.4, it's not an absolutely rigid target they have to meet. It's primarily a mechanism to encourage them to think, work across disciplines to optimize how they green their developments. Next slide, please. And I mentioned that the urban green factor is designed to address a whole range of environmental and social issues. So to encourage the development community to think about what sort of urban greening they should incorporate in their developments, we've also produced this interactive green infrastructure focus map. And what we've done here is layered a whole range of different map layers, including things like flood zones, biodiversity hotspots, air quality mapping, but also some of the socioeconomic issues around deprivation, health indices, and other factors to enable developers and planners to think about, when you're applying the urban greening factor, what are the functions and benefits you want to achieve from that development. So the urban greening factor should be designed not just to green the development, but actually to address some environmental and social economic issues in the locality. Next slide, please. So finally, conclusions. So the urban greening factor is a policy and tool that facilitates discussions. It's really aimed at driving that much more collaborative co-design between the local authority planners, the developers, and the local community to optimize the greening of the development, to get benefits which are really relevant to that local area and local community. It's very easy to calculate, and increasingly with plan applications submitted with CAD drawings, with computer-aided design drawings, it's quite easy to do the calculations, and local planning officers can quickly calculate whether the applicants have met the urban greening score. And I think I'd just like to reiterate that point. It's a sort of collaborative design tool, as well as being a policy which we expect developers to meet to help green the urban environment. Final slide. Well, that's me done. Thanks very much. Looking forward to the questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was really, really interesting. For anyone who'd like to find out more, do have a look at the handouts, which you can access via the control panel. If you click on the arrow next to handouts, underneath you'll see 2 PDFs. One of them's about green cities, and the other one is written by Peter and explains some of what he's been saying in a little bit more detail. So do download those handouts. We're now going to move swiftly on to our next speaker, who is David Lowe. David is team leader for ecology, historic environment and landscape at Warwickshire Council. He manages a team that includes 13 ecological officers, which I think will make many councils just, well, green with envy. And his ecology unit provides advice both internally and for external partners, and has won awards for its implementation of biodiversity net gain. I think many of us have heard a lot about what's happening in Warwickshire, but don't really have many details. So I'm really delighted that David can join us today to talk about the work that he and his team have been doing on biodiversity net gain. So thank you, David, and over to you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me along. It's a different audience. I've been looking at the attendance numbers. There's 426. There were 429, so 3 people have left, and it's not even got to me yet. I'll be as quick as I can. As usual, I was asked to do 15 slides, so I've now got 21. So I'm going to rattle through some just to give you an idea of how far and what we've got to the moment. So yeah, that's me, and basically this is a project area we look at, so thank you for that. For the next slide, this is where Warwickshire is, particularly for those who are elsewhere and haven't quite got a clue where Warwickshire is. We're right smack bang in the middle of England, and you'll find out how important that is in a little while. And I'm glad to see that Solihull looks like it's already gone green as a logo, which I thought is quite good. And the context is we were part of a DEFRA pilot in 2012, 2014. We were asked to run this weird and wonderful thing is called biodiversity metrics from DEFRA, and we were given the building blocks to it, but then work out what the instructions were. And that's where we came from, which is always a challenge. Next slide, please. What I always try and do is, of course, why we're here. Well, we're here because species and habitats are going downhill and going downhill fast. And if we are going to work within the planetary boundaries, from an image on the left-hand side, you can see that we're losing biodiversity hand over fist, and we're not going anywhere clear. That diagram basically is a diagram that shows that can the world cope with humans? If it's green, yes, it can. If it's red, it can't. So next slide, please. We're also, as context, we're a biological record centre, so we have a lot of species data, and we have a lot of species data. We've been going since 1974, and we have about 3 or 4 million species records sitting in filing cabinets and slowly working their way onto the computer. Next slide, please. We also have the best habitat data in the world. That's what we like to say, and I think so far I haven't been challenged on it yet. Every field and every hedge in the whole of Warwickshire, Coventry, Solihull has been surveyed and is surveyed every 5 years. So 20% of the whole area is surveyed every year. So every 5 years we have a complete refresh, you could say. Next slide, please. So this is basically what I'm going to try and go through right now, is basically green infrastructure strategy. So before we were a DEFRA pilot, we were writing a green infrastructure strategy. So I'm going to go and quickly run through what that is. Then I'll go through the years of a DEFRA pilot, the pain that took, and where at the moment is in the implementation of that green infrastructure strategy of the biodiversity net gain, and where we're going into the future, which is regulation now and future. So that's where I'm hopefully going to take you in the next 10 minutes or so. Next slide, please. So again, green infrastructure, the key thing is I wrote a GI strategy. I'll call it GI now to save my own tongue. And that GI strategy was to cover the whole of Warwickshire, Coventry and Solihull, the whole project area. And I want it to be able that a landowner, a farmer, could adopt it if they felt like it, or even a sub-regional group, which was my masters were the COSWAPO, which is Coventry, Solihull and Warwickshire Association of Planning Officers. So they asked me to write this. It was a planning-led document to be adopted into core strategies, etc. So I wanted to write something which could work at every level. And it was adopted eventually in 2013, which was interesting because, of course, the NPPF came out in 2012. So I had a whole year of writing something without having to clear what the policy was going to be. Next slide, please. It came out because of the data we've got. We were able to basically do the Lawton principles, which is a diagram on the right-hand side. We were able to show in this map where all our grasslands are, or in fact, what it mainly shows is where our grasslands aren't. The darker brown, if you could just squeeze those ones, are basically where there's 20 hectares or more in 1 kilometre square. The orange ones is basically where there's 5 to 19%. And our biodiversity strategy, if we want to do any enhancements, the core areas are already functioning as grasslands. We'd have the same map for woodlands as well, but this is illustrating grasslands. But if we have a strategic area where we want more grasslands to be, we're focusing on those areas which are 5 to 19%. We're not going to forget the white areas, which look like yellow on this map, where there's only less than 5 hectares of the whole of the 1 kilometre square of wildflower grassland. And I say wildflowers, I'm setting the bar low. They're buttercup fields almost is what our lowest denominator is, because if you didn't count those, pretty much the whole of Warwickshire would be white. So that's our strategy, is to increase biodiversity in those areas to join up so we can get a Lawtonian map. Keep that in mind as we go forward. Next slide, please. We also, if we're using the data, I wanted to find out how Warwickshire sits into the wider landscape. So we purchased some land cover data, which is a national data set from the CEH, Centre of Ecology and Hydrology. And basically, we ran the same thing at 2 kilometre squares to look where woodlands were. This is a woodland map to show corridors that led through that area. It also shows where HS2 was going, but that's who funded it, who funded the data. So HS2 did have one advantage, arguably. So what we did is look at it as a count at a regional level to see where Warwickshire sits. And I didn't even have to manipulate this data. It's fantastic. It shows you that despite the fact we only have 4% of the triple size in the whole of West Midlands, and they're all fragmented and really small, if species are going to move from the south to the north along those green pathways, then they pretty much need to go through Warwickshire, Coventry and Solihull. Because of the data level we have, we can then drill down into districts, and we can drill even further down in the bottom right into every field and every hedge in those areas to see how they function and how they work and how they contribute at that local level, farmer level, all the way up to a sub-regional decision. So we can make a decision on green infrastructure at any of those levels. Next slide, please. We also got bored one night, so we decided to do a whole lot. When Natural England gave a whole data set for the UK, we decided to do the whole thing. So that's on our maps.warwickshire.gov.uk. So if you want to use it, you can. And all I'll say after this is, well done, Wales. Sorry, Norfolk. Moving on to the next one. In 2012 even, we started to put biodiversity net gain, or no net loss as it was then, into our strategy. So since 2012, all the core strategies within Warwickshire, Coventry, Solihull have biodiversity net gain and green infrastructure locked into policy. Next slide, please. Biodiversity offsetting was there, so 2012-14. Because of that, we started doing biodiversity net gain, and on basically day 2, we worked out what it was. It was you value the future habitat of a site minus the existing value, and you've got to gain loss. Simples, as Amir Katz would say. The point being is that it actually used for land use change. You could use this for pretty much anything. We're beginning to use it for natural capital assessments on our own estates, etc. But that's the idea of what it is. Next slide, please. The DEFRA and Natural England have produced the DEFRA 2.0 calculator, which is heavily based on the Warwickshire one, and there's a screenshot in the bottom right, and I've filled in some areas to bring it back to cities, because that's what we're supposed to be talking about in some ways. There are a lot more urban characteristics you can put into that system now, better than the Warwickshire one. Next slide, please, which is this beautiful one. This is one we created, and this is a version 19.1. And believe me, this is probably, if you put it in real terms, probably version 34. So it shows you how much pain we had going through all this and learning exercise, and it's still not perfect. I'm going to release version 20 soon. But what it gains is you've dropped the habitats in. It's an Excel spreadsheet. It's easy to fill in. You just look what habitats you've got. You mark out what area you've got. And then all the other sheets really fill in themselves from the DEFRA metrics, and it pumps out a score whether you're going to have a gain or a loss. The beauty of the whole of this metric, and including the DEFRA one, it's a tool to be used before a planning application is submitted. It's a tool for the developer to use to maximize the biodiversity on site. It needs to be verified by a local authority ecologist or an independent ecologist because it's easy to fiddle. But if you set the rules, it also shows that it has been fiddled, and after that you could go to your institute if you wanted to and show that it's not being used properly. But the best thing about it is that the landscape architect and the ecologist start talking to each other on day 1, thereby building in constraints, showing the mitigation hierarchy, i.e. you avoid, you mitigate, and at last resort compensate. It shows you, it flags it up. It's easy to read and easy to use. And if you do not try to avoid something, or you can't avoid something and you haven't explained it in your documentation, basically in Warwickshire you're stuffed. You have to go back and do it again in that sense, or explain why you couldn't avoid something. Next slide, please. So implementation, here we are. We started in basically collecting monies in 2015 and 16. And so far, this is an oldish slide. We've had some more in since, but when this slide was done in back November time, we have 2.25 million in the Royal Bank of Devlet, in the Warwickshire County Council's offsetting fund. And we've so far created 6 grassland sites, enhanced 1 ancient woodland site, created 4 ponds ready for GCN license. So about 40 hectares has been created or enhanced it in Warwickshire in the last few years. And I still need to commit getting up to about £1 million more for coming up this year. We've got about a lot more schemes coming forward. So we're already making it work. And to show how it works, next slide, please. Before we get on to that, all those sites, by the way, have Wildlife and Countryside Act Section 39 agreements. They are agreements between the county council and the landowner, and they're secured for 30-year agreements with clawback clauses if they decide to renegade on those agreements, etc. So all legally applied, and it's for 30-year management plans. Next slide, please. So this is where we are. On the left-hand side, 2012-14, that's the same slide you saw earlier. That's where our fragmented grasslands in Warwickshire are basically stuffed. We need to join them up. By the end of 2020, we're done those many sites in purple, and we're starting to see we're filling in the blanks in the areas next to them. If HS2, when they do their schemes, and these are the unknown schemes, these are not the ones to do compensation yet, these are the HS2 mitigation schemes, and voluntary schemes have come on board. It looks like that. Next slide, please. 2020 to 2025, you can start seeing we're beginning to fill in the blanks even more. These are all the projects, known projects. So these are all expressions of interest we've had from people who want to do offsetting. And basically, when these come on board, Warwickshire will look like this, and these are only known nodes. We expect a lot more people to come on board to fill in more blanks. And by 2030, the green areas are where we know people are looking to purchase land or use land to put pump fine biodiversity offsetting like an environmental bond, create wildlife now, and start selling those into the system, etc. And that brings us on to, however, a protected species strategy is the next thing we need to worry about, because it's all right putting habitats in, but will the species also be able to find it? Next slide, please. So species integration, same sort of data, same sort of map. This is in draft form, we're beginning to write it. But on a right-hand map, all I wanted to show you there is that we are using another modelling tool, which is a least cost pathways, to find out if I was a grey crested newt or a woodland species in this interest, actually, where would I get to go from woodland to woodland? So we can actually fill in where the hedgerows, where best hedgerows would be, or best corridors would be to link woodlands together. And we're beginning to bring that into. Why to show you that? Next slide, please. Because that's how we feel we're going to do cities. Currently, we are rural sort of, I'm a spatial planner in the sense of a landscape ecologist. I look at the wide landscapes, and the HBA, the data we had, didn't really get into urban areas, basically because of a bit of a pain. But now we've spotted and satellite imagery, we're beginning to map all the green spaces, including the trees, etc., in that urban setting. So we can now start doing exactly what we've done in the wider countryside and start plotting links, plotting maps, plotting routes for species to move through, in this case, Kenilworth. Next slide, please. And this is basically a plug. Because of all the data and all the knowledge we've gained over the last, how many years, 7 years, we're looking to do a 3-day course in our Welsh office at Mile Hall in Ludno Junction near Wales. We've got an educational facility there. And there's a doodle poll. We're looking to do it probably in November time. And anyone who's interested, if you get enough people, and we've got 15 people set up already, if anyone's interested out there, all 402 of you, because obviously 20-something of you have already boarded and have gone. If you're interested, and these slides are distributed, hit that poll. If not, email davidlowe@warwickshire.gov.uk. I'll send you a link and register your interest. As soon as I get enough people, we'll run it. And the whole course will cover everything you need to know, basically, to deliver biodiversity net gain. That's me done. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much indeed. That was fascinating. And there was so much in there. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. So we've had 3 really interesting, very different, all very practical presentations about actually making green infrastructure better on the ground. So I hope you've all been typing, well, I know you've all been typing questions into the questions box. My colleague, Kova Sevilla, has been going through the questions and will put the questions to the panelists. So would the other speakers like to switch on their videos so that we can see you? I don't know whether Fran will be able to be visible, but I think she might be there in voice. If you could switch on your microphones as well. And then Kova, would you like to put a question to the panel, please?
Yeah. So I'm going to start with a question that I think got most mentioned. So it's about how do you get developers on board? So I think this relates to all of the speakers, and it's questions about how do you require developers to do more than the minimum policy requirements in terms of green infrastructure, and are developers responsible for maintenance of green infrastructure? And if so, how did you encourage this given financial costs?
Great.
Shall I
Would
come in first?
Penny, that would be lovely if you'd like to go first.
Okay, so I think for us, obviously we haven't gone to develop very much at the moment along what these, you've been using the strategy in the Green Space Factor tool, because we are at that beginning bit. But I think what it will really work, or what has really worked for us, is just the conversations and the fact that we engage with developers right up front. When we started talking to people back in February last year, 2019, we didn't have a vision, we didn't have anything. So we've developed that together. And so I think that conversation and moving together and having a very transparent sort of attitude towards what we're trying to do is going to really, really help. And it's already showing some dividends in that we already are seeing private developers asking to use the tools. So for me, it's about having the conversations. The maintenance question, the maintenance is really interesting, and that is one of our conundrums, because something that we've realized as a local authority, there's a lot of pressure on the cost of maintenance and trying to keep the cost of maintenance down. So in some ways you can design that in, but it's also potentially a different type of maintenance. And maintenance is one of the topics that has come up as something that we need to look at as a city and as a partnership of organisations to see how we're going to get around that. Will maintenance look different? Do we need a different type of maintenance? Do we need to think about who's involved in maintenance?
Can I just add to that? When we did workshops, we did a workshop solely with developers, so we could get to the root of what they needed a strategy to do for them to be able to use it. Because we didn't want to make a strategy that they were like, well, this is no good to us. This is what I do, and this doesn't relate to it at all. So we had lots of conversations with them around how they can actually use a strategy and what they need it to say for them to be. Most developers like certainty. They like to know what is expected of them. They don't want to find out halfway down the process that they need to change something. We also did a lot of training with developers who contacted us who wanted more information, and we did specific workshops. Where they wanted to pay for a workshop with certain members of staff. And there was one other thing I was going to mention, but it's gone, so never mind. Oh, that was it. On maintenance, what Penny said, a lot of it is educating on maintenance in terms of every building has maintenance on it. There are cherry pickers in our city every day doing maintenance. So this isn't necessarily, Penny said it a minute ago, it's not more maintenance, it's different maintenance, and it's done by different people, and we need to think about that.
Great, thank you. Peter, I wondered if you could pick this point up, because looking at the plan that was submitted, my guess would be that the early version that was submitted would have been much cheaper to maintain than the later version, which had much richer biodiversity and a more interesting landscape. Do you think that that's going to be a problem, that as you push for higher standards, the developers are going to complain that the maintenance is more expensive?
That has been an issue in the past, but I think that's beginning to change. And the main change is we did a seminar earlier this year with the Bartlett Real Estate Institute. It's part of UCL, and they're looking about they're researching real estate. What developers want, what developers do, how do you invest in real estate, what's the drivers of real estate investment. And one of the things that's becoming apparent is that a lot of people who want to invest in real estate want to shift from a economic model which was based on realizing the capital asset of that real estate, i.e. you build something and then you sell it on and you generate your income through that sale and that receipt of the capital receipt, to something which is safe in the long term, which is generating revenue, so generating rental revenue. And if your economic model is based on generating long-term rental revenue, you need better quality developments. You need less turnover of tenants. You need business tenants who are willing to pay a slightly higher premium for their rents because of the location, because of the quality of the building. So actually, real estate investors are now saying to developers, we want to invest in schemes which have deliver much better quality placemaking, and green infrastructure and urban greening is very much part of that agenda. So it's not just about the planning process, it's about who finances that development, and it's the investors who are now saying, we want you to make sure that you've got better quality developments, because we know that generates longer term, safer revenue streams. And that's quite a big shift in the economic model for urban development, and it's looking like that will actually encourage better quality. And also the developer doesn't build and then sell, they build and maintain, so they actually take responsibility for the maintenance of the public realm.
That's really fascinating and encouraging as well. And David, would you like to say what your experience in Warwickshire has been with developers?
Yeah, first of all, basically in 2013, I think all our local authority partners basically made it mandatory, pseudo-mandatory, because it was in policy. So we had very little kickback from it. So people challenged us and said, well, it's a voluntary scheme, isn't it? It's DEFRA. And we went, yes, but biodiversity net gain is written into NPPF policy. So if you can find out about another way of measuring biodiversity net gain, please let us know, because at the moment we only know one, and that's called DEFRA's calculator. And they went, oh, all right then, and they just did it. So, and we had great support from our local planning authority officers, which was brilliant in that sense, because we were their advisors in that sense. As for maintenance, we've got a meeting next week with some solicitors who've picked up our challenge, and that is to try and see if we can get the maintenance written into legal agreements when it goes into planning. So where we have legal agreements for offset sites, we're looking to apply the same legal agreements maybe with on-site management, particularly if it's passed over to a management company thereafter. Because when things are passed over to management companies, that's when you usually find the expertise to maintain the biodiversity is lost, and also if our residents, etc., are looking after those sites, they would like sometimes just to see what's amenity grassland there, not this long grass with funny stuff in it. So there's an education thing in there as well. But that goes hand in hand with the BS standard, which is out for consultation at the moment, which is biodiversity net gain. And that's got some really good standards in there. And it's a standard document, not policy one, so it's a policy document, where if you wanted to get that BS British standard, you need to say yes to everything in there. And that includes how you secure long-term maintenance on site.
Fantastic. Thank you
Judith,
very much.
Just add one quick point. I think one of the things that we've learned is that we've been developing our green infrastructure sort of policy framework in London for 10 years now. And it's very much a strategy of starting off with a policy framework which is sort of encourages people to do the right thing, gradually developing that policy framework so it gets more into a sort of voluntary process, now into a collaborative process. When you get to the point where you need to start putting in mandatory requirements, most people have already come along that road with you, rather than sort of suddenly it appears as a bombshell, this complete change. So that is that process of developing policy over a period of years that ensures that everyone comes on that journey with you.
A really good point.
Back that up as well, because with Swansea, our strategy isn't a mandatory strategy, it's a voluntary strategy, but it is supported by Planning Policy Wales, it is supported by other policies, and that again is why the conversations taking people with you is so important.
Great. Now I'd like to move on to another question. So Kova, would you like to put another question to the panel, please?
Yes, and this is going to be also, I think, one for all the speakers, and all of you can answer. It's about how are these various approaches to improving green infrastructure take into account the distribution of benefits across communities?
Right. So how do you make sure, are the different processes taking into account benefits across different communities? I wonder, Penny, would you be willing to start on that, because given the really thorough and I think very creative community consultation that you did in Swansea, you were really aware of delivering for communities.
Yeah, so I think obviously with the city centre strategy, we were looking at a small area, but whilst it was a small area, it had very different communities. So we had the actual residential community that were living in the city centre, and they had needs and aspirations. We also had the workers, people coming into the city centre to work. That's a different type of community. We also had visitors to Swansea, another community again. So I think what we tried to do with our engagement work is we tried to talk to as many people as possible. So we did that by being in all sorts of different parts of the city at different times. So literally, Fran and I spent 3 weeks where we just moved around Swansea. We spent hours in museums, on the street in the middle of the city, in the shopping arcades. We went in and talked to workers in the market. We went to libraries, we talked to groups, so that's both community groups and residential groups, but also sort of groups. So for example, we have a tree forum in Swansea, so we spent time with them. So we tried to talk to the biggest range we could. We also were really, really keen to spend time with children. So we went into the 4 primary schools that are in the city centre catchment, and we spent time with them talking about their aspirations and what was important to them in the city centre. And I think what we got from that, because we managed to speak to such a variety of people, and obviously on top of that were the professionals and the politicians and our councillors and our ward members, who are also very able to represent their communities. And what really sort of came from that was a real fantastic mixture of emotional thoughts and physical thoughts, and which we showed on our word cloud. So I think it was the variety of people we managed to speak to. What will be interesting is when we go on to do the county strategy, because I think that will be harder for us, because we'll be looking at rural communities, suburban communities, and the urban communities as well. So I think we've got an interesting sort of way. We're going to have to approach that a little bit differently. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's just trying to talk to as many people as you possibly can. I don't know, Fran, if you've got any sort of additions to make to that.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is the language was crucial. So really specific language relevant to the group that you're speaking to, and the place that you choose to meet. So when we did the face-to-face sort of participatory-based community engagement in the city, we went to some places and some places didn't work. So we'd then choose to go to a different place, and that place would work really well, and might go there a couple of times. But then we were making sure, have we captured enough of each group? Have we been to different places? We use social media to tell everybody where we were every day. So we tried to make it as accessible to people. Some people missed it and they could catch us at another place. Just making ourselves as available, as transparent and as open. And every negative comment we had, particularly on Twitter, we made a point of talking to those people and asking them and really encouraging them to come and have a conversation with us about how they felt and why they felt the way they felt.
We also worked with a local social enterprise as well, who sort of specialises in talking to people. So it wasn't necessarily always the council talking or NRW talking. It was also the consultants, and it was also the Urban Foundry as well, who sort of specialise in sort of social conversations and engagement. So that was a really useful addition to our armour, if you like.
Thanks. And Peter, thinking about the whole of London, which is a huge area with very diverse communities and limited scope for increasing green infrastructure, how are you going to make sure, or try to make sure, that the new London plan benefits everybody in terms of green infrastructure and benefits all the diverse communities as much as possible?
Well, so looking at the urban greening factor in particular, recognising that it's regeneration and urban development, which is one of the main mechanisms for greening that public realm. So the urban greening factor is designed not to be overly prescriptive. It's designed to say, you as a developer have to green your development. You have to try and meet a certain score, but the way you meet that score is dependent on conversations you have locally, the typology of the urban greening. That urban greening typology, or the urban greening intervention, needs to be addressing local circumstances. So, for example, if it's in an area of high flood risk, your urban greening should be designed to try and minimise or try to attenuate that flood risk. If your development's in an area with minimal access to green space or areas with high health issues, your urban greening should be designed to address those very issues. So it's by not being prescriptive in the type of green infrastructure, but being prescriptive in meeting a score, you encourage that local discussion, local collaboration to come up with urban greening which is meeting local needs, rather than the city authority saying every building should have a green roof.
That's really interesting, really helpful, thank you. David, you're working in a very different context. I don't know if this is a question you'd like to answer as well in terms of rural communities and what they need from green infrastructure.
Yeah, this is a planning document. So this went through the Statement of Community Involvement, which is a policy which therefore it was out for consultation for a statutory period of time. And we had quite a lot of people responding from an urban and from the rural communities on how does this work, because it was all new for biodiversity offsetting. So we held consultations in the districts and we had quite well attended, from tree wardens through to Jaguar Land Rover. So we wanted to see how it all works. So we're quite impressed at how many people took it on. And there were elements, to quote the Muppets, of the two old men in the Muppets going, oh, I don't like this, don't like this. As soon as they realised what it was and how it's fair, they suddenly went, oh, I quite like this. This is quite good. Actually, I think it's fair and open. Can you make it mandatory so we're all on the same level playing field? So that was an interesting turnaround of what responses we got. I'm also a farmer's son. I also sat on the Farming Wildlife Advisory Group in Warwickshire before it went defunct, and the Rural Hub, which is now in Warwickshire, which is very powerful. So I have good close links with the rural communities as well. And they have taken a bit longer to say, well, once they realise it, actually, I don't want your best bits. I want the bits that flood. I want the bits that aren't producing how many tons per wheat per hectare. If you want, I want those elements. I don't necessarily want your big arable fields, because of course it's horses for courses. And they went, that's brilliant. That's really satisfying. We'd love to work with you. And we have no shortage of landowners coming forward and wanting to be offset sites. It's almost like how to regulate the market more now than it is to actually pump prime it. We've gone past that stage, and that was really encouraging. The communities, both rural and urban, have picked it up. We also have a policy to say that we will try to offset sites as local to the loss, but in a strategic area for biodiversity where it's needed. So we're balancing the social justice aspects as well as the biodiversity communities, which are, of course, the invertebrate communities and Great Crest Newt communities, as well as the human communities.
Thank you. Now we're getting towards the end of our time, but I'd love to be able to get one more question in. You're going to have to answer really quickly though. So Kova, is there one last question that could be answered fairly quickly?
Yeah, I hope so. This one's for Peter specifically, and it's about how the urban greening factor can work with other tools like the biodiversity metric, and whether it should be prioritized against other types of tools.
No, so our view is that the urban greening factor can be used to deliver on biodiversity net gain. So the biodiversity net gain approach is fantastic in Warwickshire. It doesn't work quite so well in an urban situation because most of the sites that are being developed in urban areas have got quite low biodiversity. So a 10% uplift of not very much is not very much. So our view is that if you apply the urban greening factor, if on that particular development you want to secure biodiversity net gain, again, it's about the design of the urban greening. You can design your urban greening to maximize biodiversity if that's relevant for that particular development. And most developments, even if you're not designing it specifically for biodiversity, for most urban developments, as long as you're not building on a greenfield site, you're going to put in urban greening, vegetation, which is going to result in an uplift in biodiversity almost as a sort of secondary benefit. So I'm sure there will be some circumstances where you might need to have biodiversity net gain as the driver, but in most circumstances in an urban environment, by applying the urban greening factor, biodiversity net gain is almost a default secondary benefit.
Thank you very much. And for anyone who's interested in finding out more about the urban greening factor, don't forget to look at the handouts, which you can find on the webinar control panel. If you click on the handouts section, there's 2 handouts there that you can download one of which is about the urban greening factor. We are coming towards the end of our time. This is the last of our Green Cities webinars. We've had 3 of them. If you've missed the previous webinars, you can watch recordings which are available from our website, and you will be sent more information about that as well. But the website link is there on your screen at the moment. So this webinar and the previous 2 will be up there for you to have a look at. I'd also just like to mention that on the 30th of July, the TCPA is running a webinar about stewardship, looking at different models of funding and maintaining community assets, including green infrastructure, parks and green spaces. So if you're interested in that, and I know many people interested in green infrastructure are really keen to find new ways of thinking about the long-term management and funding of green spaces. So that webinar is called The Heart of the Matter, Long-Term Stewardship in New Communities, and it's on the 30th of July, and you can find out more about that on the events section of the TCPA's website. We'd love to find out more about whether or not you've enjoyed this webinar. I hope you have. We've still got hundreds of people watching, so I assume we've done something right, but we'd love to get some feedback. So we will be sending all the participants a questionnaire, and we'd be really grateful if you could fill that in. I'd like to thank the 4 speakers who we've had today very, very much for their presentations. They've been really interesting and rich with detail, which I think people would be very keen to find out more about. Very practical stuff about how you actually make things happen, which is really good to hear. Very encouraging that so many good things are happening around the country as well. So I'd like to thank you all very, very much for your presentations. I'd also like to thank my colleagues who have been providing behind the scenes support. Alex and Isaac and Jack and Kova, thank you very much for making sure things run smoothly. And finally, just to say the Green Cities project in the UK is being run by the TCPA on behalf of the Green Infrastructure Partnership. If you're not a member of the partnership, do join. It's free to join, and we send out a newsletter 10 times a year, which will keep you updated about what's happening in terms of green infrastructure across the UK and about the Green Cities project as it continues. So thank you all very much, and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.